In this video, we're going to walk through some of the things that we're going to need to think about as we keep working on our poker program. So, particularly, I'm going to try and help walk you through some of the things you're going to need to do in order to successfully complete your homework for Tuesday. So the first thing that you're going to need to do, which is actually going to be part of your lab assignment, is you're going to need to write a function that's going to sort a hand of cards. I've already done this. I've called it the sort card function here. It's a value returning function. It returns a vector of cards that is going to be the sorted version of whatever gets passed into the function. So many options here. That's the option I chose to take. I'm not going to show you the code for what that is, but here is the declaration of that function. Sort cards. And the first thing that we want to talk about is kind of why we want to sort the cards. There's going to be a huge benefit to sorting the cards in that eventually we're going to have to write a handful of functions that will rank the various poker hands, and knowing for a fact that my cards are sorted from smallest value to the largest value. Here I have noted that I'm thinking of the ace as a high card, which generally is in poker, although if you would like in a straight, you're allowed to use an ace as a low card. So that's something to always be keeping in mind when you're writing your functions. The benefit is that writing those functions becomes a whole lot easier. So for example, you are going to have to write something that checks to see if the hand that you have is a straight. So I've explained this if you're unfamiliar with poker. Got this nice website up here that's it's got the poker hands and their rankings for what beats what, worldseriesofpoker.com, and it goes to poker hands. It's got them all listed. So it has hand strength from the strongest hand up here down to the weakest hand down here and how they're ranked. But for example, here's a straight. Right? 5 cards of sequential rank in at least 2 different suits if it's going to be just a straight. If it's 5 cards of sequential rank and they're all the same suit, then what you have is called the straight flush, which is much better. Right here. Here it is, straight flush. So these 5 cards in order, it becomes a lot easier to check for that kind of poker hand if you know that the cards in your hand in the program are already sorted from your lowest card to your highest card. You're just going to go through and check to see if the next one in line has a numerical value that's one above the one that came before it, with that minor caveat that you do have to worry about what happens when there's an ace at the top, because in our version of this poker program, we've given a value of 1 to an ace. So there's a huge benefit to knowing for a fact that our hand is sorted. It's going to make writing those programs, those functions, easier. So here's what I will do. I will give you a small demonstration of how to use my sort card function and show you that it does in fact work. So show you the outcome of that. So I'm going to come into my program. Here all I'm doing is, at the moment, I'm going to seed the random number generator. I'm going to create my card deck, and now let's go ahead and let's make a vector of cards called a hand, and it's going to be the result. It's going to be the return value of this deal hand function. And my deal hand function takes in the deck so that it'll change the deck and know which cards it has dealt, and it also takes in a number, which is how many cards I want to deal, and I'm going to deal myself a 5-card poker hand. So a vector of cards called hand, which is deal hand, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call my print hand function, and I'm going to pass it my hand, and we'll print to the screen what my hand originally looked like. Then what we'll do is we'll sort the hand. So we'll set the hand equal to the consequence of my sort cards function. So my sort cards function takes in a vector of cards called hand, and it returns the sorted vector of cards. So we'll take hand and we'll replace it with what it is once it's sorted. Now my hand has been totally sorted, and then we'll print it to the screen again. So that's what this chunk of code does. First, it's going to deal me a hand of cards. It's going to print it as it is, sort of willy-nilly in whatever order. Then it's going to sort it, and then I'm going to print the hand again. So that's what we'll see on the screen. We run our program. And originally, my hand looked like 3, 7, 10, 6, 2, so you could see it was out of order, and my sort hand function does seem to work. It takes 2, 3, 6, 7, 10. So there's an example of the fact that our sort card hand function works. And the next thing that I'm going to do here to kind of give you an idea of how this is beneficial to us is I'd like to write some code that checks to see if my hand contains a pair. Now I am going to be a little bit sloppy about this. There are a handful of choices for what we're going to do. The way that I envision my program working in the end, my poker program working, is having a handful of functions. Is royal flush, is straight flush, is flush, is straight, is full house, is pair, etc. And what I would do is, it can be a little bit difficult to check to see if your hand, or just a little bit annoying to check to see if your hand has exactly a pair and nothing else. That could be an annoying thing to check. So what I would rather do is write a function called contains pair. Does my hand that I'm handing you contain at least a pair? Maybe there's more, I don't know. Maybe there's 3 of a kind, maybe there's 2 pair. But does it contain at least a pair? And my thought would be is that I wouldn't bother calling this function. I could use this function to determine if I have exactly a pair in the case that I only call it to check to see if there hasn't been a higher ranking hand already there. So for example, I would like to write a function contains pair that only checks to see if I contain a pair, and so that would answer true if I had 4 of a kind. But I would have a different function called contains 4 of a kind, and if I pass this Boolean valued function contains 4 of a kind, and that comes back true, then I'd never bother calling the contains pair function. So that's how I would get around checking to see if it contains exactly a pair. Is just sort of later on I would code that in when I'm checking for things. So here, let's write the code and then hopefully that'll be a little bit more clear. So now my hand is sorted, and this is going to be beneficial to me. I know that if my hand is sorted numerically, then if I contain a pair in my hand, they're going to be right next to each other. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to loop through my cards for integer I equal to 0, I less than hand.size, and I'm going to do hand.size minus 1 or increment to be a little careful. I don't want to step off the end of my array. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a Boolean before I get inside this for loop called contains pair, and I'm going to set that equal to false. We're going to assume a priori that our hand does not contain a pair, and if we find evidence that says otherwise, then we'll update this Boolean. So the evidence that would say otherwise is we're going through our hand and we're comparing hand.I.number if hand of I.number is equal to hand at I plus 1.number. If that is the case, then we're going to set contains pair equal to true. And we're going to spell it right and capitalize that. If it happens to be the case that hand at I.number is equal to hand at I plus 1.number, which is all I need to check because my hand is sorted after all, then I do contain a pair. I found 2 cards in a row that have exactly the same value. It's the ones in a row, those are the only ones I have to care about. And so this is all I need to write. The reason I didn't want to go all the way up to hands.size is then when I tried to compare to hand at I plus 1, I'd jump off the end of the array. So that's the reason that I need to subtract this 1 here. And this should be the code that I need in order to determine if my hand contains a pair. Remember, it contains at least a pair, because I'm not checking to see if maybe I have 3 of a kind, or maybe I have 4 of a kind. If I ran this function, contains pair, on something that did contain 4 of a kind, it would say, yeah, you contain a pair, because I do contain at least a pair. So let's just see, let's run our program a couple times and see if we can get lucky and see when it contains a pair. Shouldn't be too horribly hard or take too horribly long with any luck. So let's write a little bit of code. Let's say if contains pair is true, then let's print to the screen we have a pair. One. Otherwise, we'll say better luck next time. So let's run this a couple times and see if we get lucky, to see if we can tell if our code is working. And then if we're not getting very lucky, we'll go back and we'll hack our hand to make it contain some things we want it to. So let's run the program. We see the results. Look at that, we got lucky the first time. Our hand did contain a pair. It had a pair of 2s right here. And in fact, our code picked that up. So that's a good thing. Let's run the program one more time and in a sense hope we get unlucky to see if we get something that doesn't contain a pair, in which case we want to make sure we hit this better luck next time branch. Let's run it again. And here we had a pair again. Wow, we're getting lucky. And here we didn't, which is what we would expect. 3, 5, 9, Queen, King. There is no pair there, and in fact we picked that up. Better luck next time. Nope, no pair. So the benefit of our hand being sorted is that this code for containing pair only has to go through and check sort of sequential things in our array instead of all possible pairs of things in our hand, which is a little bit more costly of an operation to do. So here we've got our code that checks to see if we contain a pair. The last thing that I want to talk about that will hopefully help you out as you're writing this program is what you're supposed to do for your assignment on Tuesday is be able to compare hands. So you'll have your original hand, the 5 cards that you've been dealt, and then what you're doing is you're thinking about what cards you might want to replace if you were playing 5-card draw. And your computer is going to keep a certain number of designated cards in your hand and swap out the other cards in your hand and create, 1,000 or 100,000 or a million new hands and try to compare them to the hand that you have to say which hand is better, the hand that you started with or the hand that you have when you make that replacement and get 3 new cards from the deck at random. So in order to do that, we're going to have to be able to compare the value of hands. Now the rules for this are, first and foremost, you go back to this World Series of Poker ranking, and each card hand that you have has a rank. Royal flush beats a straight flush, beats 4 of a kind, beats a full house. It goes down in this way. So if you had 2 hands, one of which was a straight and one of which was, just a pair, then the straight would beat the pair, and that's enough. It doesn't matter what the straight is, doesn't matter what the pair is, the straight's going to beat the pair because it's a higher ranking hand. So that's the first thing to always check. That's the easiest rule breaker, or the rule, I guess I should say. So if you have 2 hands and one of them has a higher rank than the other, the higher ranking hand wins, no matter what. Now where things get interesting is when you have 2 hands of equal rank and you need to find a way to break the tie. So for some of these cases, that's easy. So for example, if you're talking 4 of a kind, remember that we're just dealing with one deck at the moment. We're not dealing with multiple decks. And so if I'm sitting there with 4 of a kind and another player is sitting there with 4 of a kind, we can't have the same 4 of a kind. So I have all the 5s in the deck. So if somebody else has another 4 of a kind, it's a different number. So what we do to break the tie between our hands of equal rank is the person with the higher number that is 4 of a kind wins. So if I have 4 5s and the other player has 4 6s, then the other player wins. Now, that can get a little bit, so that's a nice little rule breaker for 4 of a kind. That can be a little bit hairy because, for example, if I have a straight, 8, 9, 10, Jack, Queen, and I have some various suits in here, there are enough other cards that theoretically somebody else who has a straight could have exactly the same cards I do, 8, 9, 10, Jack, Queen, so they could also have a straight, and they might have literally the exact same cards with different suits, in which case we would end up tying for that hands, and if we were betting, we would split the pot. On the other hand, supposing we go down to something like 1 pair. Suppose all I have is a pair and I have a pair of aces. Somebody else could have a pair of aces as well. We could tie in terms of rank and each have a pair. We could each have a pair of aces furthermore, because there's enough cards in the deck for that, 4 aces. And what we would do from there is we would compare high cards. So if I have a pair of aces and a 9 and my opponent has a pair of aces and an 8, as their next highest card, then I would win because my 9 beats their 8. And again, of course, remember we could tie because I could literally have ace-ace 9-6-4, and my opponent could have ace-ace 9-6-4, and we would consider that a split pot. So a handful of things to think about. You do want to think about writing some sort of check for rank. That's the number one rule. Run the two hands. If one of them outranks the other, then that one wins. If you have two hands of equal rank, you're going to have to check possibly for a high card, or remembering it would have to be a high card of sort of the winning, contributing cards. So just to do one specific example of that, supposing we have two players with 4 of a kind. Suppose I have 5-5-5-3, but my opponent has 6-6-6-2. I don't want to just sort of compare leftover high cards, because I have the 3 and my opponent has the 2, and so if I were comparing just those cards, you would think that I won, when I didn't, because my opponent has 4 6s. On the flip side, if I had 5-5-5, I don't remember what I was going to say. So you do want to be careful that you're comparing sort of the high card of the things that matter, and not just high card in general. So again, so that's what I was going to say. Suppose I had 5-5-5 ace, but my opponent has Jack, Jack, Jack 2. You don't just want to check high cards, because my high card is an ace, and my opponent's high card is a jack, and you would think that I win in that situation. However, it's their jacks that are more important because they all match, and my 5s are somehow more important than the ace because my 5s are what match. So you do have to be a little bit careful. You're going to have to take these cases into consideration. What I thought I would do in terms of coding is I would give you a code that sort of goes through and checks for high card. Remembering that maybe our high cards are the same, and then we dwindle down to who has the next highest card, and so on, and it is possible to tie with that. So let's write that bit of code. So here's what I'm going to need to do. I'm going to need to create another hand. So let's create a vector of cards called other hand, which is the consequence of dealing a hand from the deck with 5 cards. And let's sort it. Sort cards of itself. Let's not print the original hand as it is all messed up. Let's only print it once after it's been sorted, and let's print other hand as well. So we can see the hand, and print hand of other hand. Don't get too carried away with this other hand nonsense. So we'll print both hands. And then let's write some code. It's not going to work properly with what's going to be dealt here. But let's just write the code that we would put into a function that would go through hand and other hand and compare to see who the player is. So we'll think about the hand as belonging to player 1 and the other hand as belonging to player 2. And here's what we'll do. We'll go through their cards, starting with the highest card and dwindling down from there, and we'll compare them for value. So let's start with an integer I, which is equal to hand.size minus 1. Let's continue while I is greater than or equal to 0. And let's subtract 1, I minus minus. So here, I'm remembering that my hands are ordered. And so my highest cards are going to be located at the end. So what I want to do is start at the end of my hand and work my way from my highest card all the way down to my lowest card. So that's the reason I'm doing this loop in a sort of reverse order. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say if hand at I dot number is strictly greater than other hand at I dot number. If I have a higher hand here, I'm going to print out player 1 wins. So let's be a little bit cautious about this. So if hand at I dot number is strictly greater than other hand at I dot number, then we would want to say player 1 wins. We have to be a little careful with that, as we've seen, or as we've sort of discussed before, is that it's possible that hand at I.number is 13, so the hand, highest card is a king, but maybe other hand at I.number is 1 because it's an ace. Well, in that case, the ace would outrank the king. So this if statement is going to work all the time unless other hand at I is a king, is an ace, in which case we're going to have sort of done this poorly. So if hand at I.number is greater than other hand at I.number, or conversely, it could be the case that hand at I.number is 1 and other hand at I.number is something else, and we wouldn't be picking that up either. So this situation right here is not accounting for aces. So maybe what we want to do is account for aces first and then do something along these lines. So let's do an else if statement here. Let's make this an else if, and then we'll come add an if statement up here. So if hand at I.number is equal to 1 and other hand at I.number is not equal to 1, this would be a situation where player 1 has an ace and player 2 does not. So then we'll print out player 1 wins. And after we've established that player 1 wins, I don't want to continue checking cards, and so I'd like to break out of this loop. So we'll break at this point and not check anything further. What should be our next else if statement? Well, our else if statement should check this the other way around. What if other hand at I.number is equal to 1 and hand at I.number is not equal to 1. So this is the other situation. This is the situation where player 2 has an ace and player 1 does not. Then we'll say player 2 wins. Player 2 has an ace. We do not. And so this handles all ace situations other than aces tying. So this handles player 1 has an ace, player 2 does not. This handles player 2 has an ace, player 1 does not. And we haven't handled the case where they tie. When they tie, we just want to move on to the next card anyway. So let's not worry about that. So now let's think about the situation. Aces are sort of finished. So hand at I.number is greater than hand at other hand at I.number. This would be dealing with 2s through kings. And we would be saying that player 1 has a top card whose number is greater than player 2. So we'd say that player 1 wins in this situation. And then we have another similar situation, else if. And we want to break in each of these situations. Sorry, I should have added my break lines everywhere. Once we've found a winner, we don't need to keep searching. Break out. Else if other hand at I.number is greater than hand at I.number. In that situation, we will print out that player 2 wins. And then the line. And what else? If we've dealt with aces, with one person having an ace and the other person not having an ace in both directions, we've dealt with outranking either player 1 or player 2. The only other situation is that on this particular card we have a tie, in which case we want to continue with our loop and do another round, move on from that highest card to the next highest card, and do this process all over again. And if we survive, if we make it all the way through the loop, we get down to the 0th card and we survive this last case. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do one last else if statement. This else if statement is for I've made it all the way through my 5 iterations of the loop. I haven't broken out of the loop anywhere else. And I've made it this so far. So otherwise, if I is equal to 0, if I've made it this far to this last else if part, and I haven't broken out of the loop yet, then I know I've gone all the way down to the last card and we've tied every step of the way. So at this point we would want to print out it's a tie. And end the line, and there's no point in breaking because we're at the end of the loop anyway. So let's compile that and see if it wins. Remember, it's not going to accurately check. All this is doing at the moment, this isn't checking for rank at all. So whichever of my hands comes up, hand or other hand, with the highest card is going to come out of this situation. So let's see. Let's run it and see what happens, see if it does what we expect. So our first person has a pair of jacks. They do have a pair. Our second player has a pair of kings, so they would actually win, but they have this high card of an ace, which is higher than this. So we've established this player 2 wins, which is correct anyway, but even if it were incorrect, code would have found it here. So let's run it again and see if we can see some examples of that. So 2, 4, 6, 6 king, 5, 7, 9, 10 queen. It's going to say player 1 wins. That's actually correct, so let's see if we can get something that isn't correct. So you can see the flaw here. 6, 10, queen, king, ace, 5, 6, 8, queen, ace. Better luck next time. It says player 1 wins. They match on the ace, and then player 1 has the king. That's actually true. Okay. Seriously, we should get unlucky by now. Okay, here we go. Here's a good example. Top cards match. Player 1 and player 2 each have a king. Notice that player 1 has a pair of 4s, and player 2 has nothing. They just have a high card of a king. The nice part about that is, because player 2 has the next highest card with this queen here, our program said player 2 wins. So we match on the king, and then it went to the next highest card, and it said player 2 had a queen. Didn't care about the pair. It said that player 2 won, when it clearly player 2 did not win. He just has high card. Player 1 has the pair. So we need to combine the code that we have here with some other things that check for rank and check for other technicalities, but we're off to a good start. So that's all I wanted to do in this video, give you some hints and help for the homework, and I'll see you in class next time.